So I'm going to talk to you about a technology that gets left off of lists of sustainability technologies. You think about sustainability, you think about water sanitation, you think about photovoltaics and stuff. But communication tools are also, to me, one of the most powerful weapons or tools that we have right now to foster a smoothish journey for humans in the next few decades, going through this incredible growth spurt that we've been on for 200 years. And I've used a word lately to talk, and when talking about this, the word is noosphere, which you can see here, you'll see here in a second. And I'll explain the pound sign in a few minutes, so some of you know what that means. And noosphere, the last thing the world needs is a new word. We have way too many new words. Terabyte, Google, Twitter, tweep. But you'll learn soon this is not a new word. It's actually a new spelling of quite an old word, but it's a very powerful concept. So I'm going to start by kind of bringing you down a little bit. You know, we all have felt kind of like this cameraman I photographed at the Copenhagen Climate Talks in 2009, who's leaning on his tripod, drained of energy, as many people in that exhibition hall were, and as I was, after weeks of reporting on the world's efforts to carve a new climate treaty, and they came up short. And a lot of things were realized then about the limits of diplomacy as a tool in decarbonizing the world's growing energy menu. And we're going to go forward with a lot more what's called soft diplomacy, soft law, and less of a sense that we're going to have some hard binding agreement that's going to be the thing that magically makes us transform our energy appetites. And it's easy to get into this mode of thinking when you look at the trajectories for human endeavors in the last few centuries, at least some of them. Basically, our numbers have been exploding, of course. You know, in 1800, not too long ago, there were 1 billion people on the planet. That's babies, old people, young people. Of course, the old people in those days were 40. There weren't a lot of true elders. So 1 billion people then, and now there's 1 billion teenagers, just teenagers. Which, you know, that just wrap your head around that data point, and you know, wow, that's kind of impressive. And of course, there's 1 billion more younger people below them, which means we're going to have more babies in the next few decades. Those kids are going to procreate. It's something that humans do. And if you go to populationaction.org, you can see there's a tool there where you put in your birthday and you find where you are on the curve of us. So if you were born in 1928 or 1998, you can see where you are. I was right when we were about just approaching 3 billion people. I was born in 1956. And it's kind of like it looks like a ski slope or an amusement park thrill ride. We've been in a spurting, sort of zooming trajectory. And of course, that's not just our numbers, but our appetites for resources have been in a similar trajectory. There are hopeful signs going forward that there can be what I called a few years ago in the blog, peak us. You've heard about peak oil, peak everything. But there is a moment when there will be peak us. And not just our numbers, but appetites too. There's evidence that actually we do end up not always getting richer and buying more. There's kind of a possibility of shifting these curves. The question that I'll be talking about here for the next 45 minutes, and then before we get into Q&A, is what can we do with this noggin that we have, with this amazing intelligence we have inherited, to avoid kind of running off the road, you know, as we go around these curves toward mid-century and beyond. And now the more woe is me part is, let's just think about this. This is Black Friday a couple of years ago. A photographer from the Times went to a Target store. You know, everyone's buying the 3 shirts for $15. Can you imagine 9 billion people shopping this way? What would that look like? If we all end up with a kind of prosperous middle class life on the planet doing this, something about that feels like you can't fit that on the planet. And this is what's gotten many scientists increasingly, whether they're looking at the atmosphere, at our impacts on biodiversity, on the cycles of carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus and other elements, talking about planetary boundaries. Now, I don't completely buy into that. Some of those boundaries are not really boundaries, because what happens is when we push hard against one edge, we tend to adapt and shift to some new thing to kind of pull us through. So innovation can have a powerful effect at mediating or sort of lengthening those boundaries. But there are some real ones, and the unfortunate thing is so far we haven't really demonstrated we're capable adjusting our behavior ahead of time before we hit the edge. And so far, we're kind of like, there's not a lot to distinguish our trajectories so far from that of bacteria smeared on a plate of agar. And I don't know how many of you or your kids have done this, where you take a swab, you put it on your dog's paw, and then you put it on the agar. My son did this a couple of years ago. It just grows and grows and grows until the resources run out, or the waste products ham it in. And if you can't, are you hearing me okay? I am a musician on the side, so I know how to eat the microphone if I need to. And for about 50 years, scientists have basically been saying one thing: there's an edge to the petri dish. Hello, and scientists in different fields have said this in different ways with different levels of confidence for decades. And at the IPCC meeting, the climate panel meeting in Paris, I'm not doing that, am I? Yeah, in 2007, Martin Prairie was summarizing the anticipated impacts from global warming on systems, water, food, et cetera. And he's basically saying there's an edge to the petri dish in this image. And remember, to my mind, and I've written this on .earth repeatedly, when I look at our behavior as a species the last couple hundred years, it reminds me of those teenagers. And a teenage approach to life is kind of like, look what I can do. It's very much about, it's sort of that cow-tipping, car-racing phase of living where you're not really thinking long-term. You're thinking about what's in front of you and what your potentiality is and taking what you can. And so far, if you substitute fossil fuels for testosterone, that's kind of like the mode we've been in. And scientists, when you play out that thought experiment, they're kind of like the chiding parent. When you come home too late, or you ding the car or something, and the parent's like this. And I keep thinking my best sort of arts metaphor of this is Rebel Without a Cause, the movie.
What kind of company for all those kind of parties turn into? Start a place for kids.
A minute ago you said you didn't care if he drinks.
He said a little drink.
You're tearing me apart!
So James Dean is us. Everyone who is not the expert, warning or chiding, pointing the finger, saying, woe is me, shame on you. And so that feeling of resistance, and you can recognize it sometimes. And I've seen it over and over again. The Supreme Court debate about carbon dioxide, whether or not it was a pollutant. There's a point where Justice Scalia says, they're arguing a point of science, and he says, this is why I really don't want to deal with this issue called global warming very much anyway. It's all this science. And it's too facile, it's too easy to look at that scenario that happened there at the Supreme Court and say it's just some some conservative Luddite. And by the way, I've met him, he's not a Luddite at all, he's a very smart guy. But that's too simple. There's part of all of us that doesn't really want to deal with this, really, thank you very much. We still drive our cars, I had to fly to the Midwest to speak here at University of Missouri, and we can't just talk the talk. And there's another discomfort factor recently, which is way back in the 20th century, and there's a chunk of those. To us, to the graybeards in the room, it's kind of something to chuckle about. That idea that the 20th century is already a while ago, but there's a bunch of people in this room who've lived more than half of their lives now in the 21st century, and that's kind of, to me, whoa. So way back in the 20th century, when I was 12 or so in the 1960s, we would have our supper, our mac and cheese or our TV dinners, and we had the information about the world was just handed to us by this very avuncular guy, and you could kind of flip channels, and there are all these white old guys giving you a reassuring picture that we all absorbed together about the state of the world. And the way he summarized it was this way.
This is my last broadcast as the anchor man at CBS Evening News, and that's the way it is. Friday, March 6, 1981.
That's the way it is. So we didn't have to actually think. It was really kind of cool. So now, if your issue is, well, you could choose your issue, but if your issue is climate change, you go on the internet, and you can go to any one of these sites depending on your predisposition. If you're libertarian, choose climate audit or what's up with that. If you're liberal, choose climate progress. If you're a reality seeker, go to noaa.gov or .earth. And you can kind of comfort yourself with comfort food still, so it's still the same feeling, but you're dining at the world's biggest food court. And so everyone can choose his or her source of information. So the web which I see as overall having an incredible potential to be a source of collaboration and a source of innovation and a source of empathy, meaning starting to understand each other globally and locally, can also divide us and put us in bubbles. But so one thing I want to have you come away with, if anything, is to know that you can't go into this and just have that 20th century feeling of being relaxed about information. You have to do some of the work. Going forward, we're all part of this networked intelligence, and we all have a role in clarifying what is and is not reality, and then what you do about it. And I think that's a mixed bag. It's kind of good. It's unnerving, but I think it's exciting at the same time. Now, just to get back to the bummer part of this. So remember, I was saying in the old days it was this, in the new days it's this. And all of this feels so consequential to those of us who spend a lot of time on energy and the environment. You know, this is like a big chunk of our days is this. And what we forget is that this has to fit into our bigger basket of things that we're thinking about on a day-to-day basis. And the other day, I blogged on this. I created this as a slide, and a 2-slide explanation of why global warming was not in the presidential debates. And here's the second slide. Look for this slide and this slide. There's a website called newsmap.jp. I don't know why it's a Japanese domain. You go there and it gives you a picture of the news of the moment, what people are reporting on, what's on different websites. And at that moment, at midnight, the other night after the third debate, this was the map of what we were all thinking about. And I kind of stitched in, you can see way down in there is that big giant conversation about climate is in this tiny little postage stamp in the middle of that larger picture. And we have to get comfortable with the reality that despite its consequential nature, it's not something that naturally fits into our discourse on a day-to-day basis. Now here I'm going to take you down a little further before we kind of climb out of the psychic hole and explore the batch of science that I came pretty late to, and that I think a lot of people thinking about climate and sustainability came late to. And that's not the science of ecology or the science of glaciology, which is the stuff I spent more than 20 years writing about, but the science of psychology and sociology. In other words, how do we receive information? What makes us resist information or embrace it? What makes us worried? What makes us respond and react to worry in an intentional, active way? Or what makes us retreat and retrench and buy an SUV when we're worried? And that science is incredibly powerful. And it says that, among other things, the thing I spent my life doing, providing information, presumably filling a deficit. There's this actual deficit theory of knowledge that, and scientists have been as in denial about it as reporters, that, well, if you just provide people with information that's reliable, they'll then change their lives or change their votes and stuff. But there's a body of work that says that isn't so simple. And that's why I did a piece a while back called An Inconvenient Mind. And I illustrated it with, there's a body of work at this website called culturalcognition.net. So anyone taking notes, have a look there. It's dark and depressing because it reveals, but it doesn't have to be. It's illuminating because it reveals through empirical work, research, experimentation, that people are deeply divided on issues, often in a very primordial way. It's not a function of disinformation or propaganda or corruption. That there's a range from libertarian to liberal that these social scientists call individualist to communitarian. I don't know why we have to invent complicated terms for simple things, but individualists are people who want to control their lives and don't resist big government and don't want someone else to impose a tax on them. And liberals or communitarians are people who want to share and have empathy and have a big group hug and have a common approach to all problems. And I grew up kind of like that. And what you find when you look at this body of work is that more information doesn't matter. Actually, more knowledge, more degrees, and more advanced education makes a libertarian more libertarian. There was a study that showed that the more education a Republican has, on average, the more skeptical that person is of global warming. With Democrats, if you have a college education, you're more concerned about global warming than a Democrat without a college education. So what does that say? It says information doesn't necessarily matter. And so I spent, again, my 20 years working on providing information. That's one thing that led me out of journalism toward academia and other things, it was that realization that, you know, I could spin my wheels for the next 20 years, or I could actually figure out how information works. And there are ways to make it work. I'm going to give you one illustration that I think demonstrates clearly that this isn't about fossil fuel disinformers and stuff. I know Climate of Doubt, the TV show, et cetera, all that stuff is real. I wrote about it. I exposed a lot of it when I was a news reporter at the Times. But just check this out. So after Fukushima happened, after that epic disaster in Japan caused that nuclear power plant, those reactors to dysfunction, and there was radiation leaks, and it was a devastating event in many ways. And two of the world's leading environmentalists came away from that with the precisely opposite reactions. Bill McKibben, who's a friend of mine for 20 years, is America's essentially leading environmental champion, and George Monbiot, who in England is kind of the Bill McKibben of England. They wrote pieces the same day and had completely divergent conclusions. Monbiot was very worried about global warming, and he said that this accident proved that nuclear power is robust. 9.0 earthquake, epic tsunami, and the system had terrible problems, but it didn't disrupt, it didn't melt down, it didn't cause mass casualties. In fact, the deaths from stress among people who were just relocated, about 800 people died as a result of the relocation from that terrain. It's unlikely, he calculated, that we'll ever see a mortality rate from the accident from radiological illness anywhere near that. And Bill McKibben wrote, this proves that we have to turn off all our nuclear power plants, get small, generate our energy locally, renewably, blah, blah, blah. So that says to me, again, there's no like Exxon involvement here. It just says that we have normal, very well-educated people can come away from the same event with completely divergent messages. And I think we need to get comfortable with that. It's hard. It makes this all seem a lot harder, the challenge of decarbonizing a global energy economy as we head toward 9 billion people seeking better lives. But I think it's doable. And I actually still wake up most mornings optimistic. And I go to bed kind of bummed out, but I usually wake up the next morning optimistic again. And maybe it's just pathology. It could be pathology, so that doesn't mean I'm right or anything. Don't follow me necessarily. You can do whatever you want. One last message out of Fukushima comes from these stones, which illustrate this is not just about global warming. And I think it also helps us reassure us that it's kind of normal for us to sort of screw up when it comes to warnings and big events. These are tsunami stones that you can find, that I wrote about. I wasn't in the disaster area, but I was tracking it closely. They're centuries old, and they're tsunami warning stones. And basically, here's what they say in Japanese. High dwellings are the place and harmony of our descendants. Remember the calamity of the great tsunamis. Do not build any homes below this point. Oops, you know, and so time passes, the message fades. Tsunamis are unpredictable. This particular earthquake was really on a fault that no one really understood very well. And so the message got lost in history. Its disaster memory fades. And so what I wrote at the time, a reader pointed out to me, well, you know, what if we get it that wrong? So even when history in a place tells you directly, this is a place that's dangerous, be careful, and we disregard those messages, and I think it makes me feel a little more okay with our failure so far to pick up the momentum on the issues around the building greenhouse effect. That doesn't mean I'm saying, hey, don't worry, be happy. I'm just saying we got to get real about what we're like as individuals and as societies. So a piece I did before that, years earlier on .earth, had this headline, "Are we stuck with blah, 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 bang?" And that came from a reader comment. My readers are my teachers often. Some of them are unruly students. They're like, you know, shut up, or there's some commenters on my blog are pests. But every day I learn something. Amid all the pestilence, there's insight. And the reader in Germany had posted this note that said, basically, are we stuck with this? Are we stuck with this pattern? And I think we're not. And I do think with climate in particular, there's paths forward that we can follow that don't run into the same blockades. The first real reality is that climate matters. Climate matters. It's one of the things everyone pays attention to on a day-to-day basis through the weather that is shaped by the climate system. You know, it mattered in Moscow with the great heat wave. It mattered in Pakistan with the great floods. It mattered in Joplin terribly with a tornado outburst. And across such a big chunk of this region, And so you can have teachable moments. Then you have to figure out, what do you teach? What is it how can we best go forward and educate society on how to mitigate risks from climate vulnerability that exists today, plus what could come through the greenhouse influence on climate. And then, of course, water matters, and it matters hugely, especially in places that don't have much or are vulnerable to too much. Here, I took this picture. I don't know how well you can see the slides. But in the Amazon, I was there in the 1989 and 90 writing a book about a murder in the Amazon of Chico Mendes called The Burning Season. And I walked in, I was in Manaus, a big city in the Amazon, and walking down the street, and there was a funeral parlor. Like most of the stores there, it's open air, it's just like open to the street. And there was a pile of coffins, and basically there were coffins in all sizes. And for me, that was shocking, coming from, basically a middle-class upbringing in Rhode Island. And just the idea that it would be normal in a funeral parlor to have coffins in all sizes, like Starbucks cups, really was sort of jarring. And that was 20-something years ago, but there's still 1 billion or more people on the planet today for whom the death of a child from waterborne disease is a normal occurrence. It's not a surprise or a shock or an outrage. And that says there's great opportunities right now to improve lives by sharing technology and ideas and concepts as simple as hand washing. Hand washing day was just a few days ago. And finding ways to communicate that creatively and making sure that young kids in slums and poor places are learning how to foster good sanitation and develop the handling of wastes in places that don't have money. There's great opportunities in all that. Also, water matters where we are too. This is where I live. In the Hudson Valley. This was the road down the hill from my house after Irene came through. And this storm called Sandy could actually do the same thing in the early next week to us. So our road, these roads were impassable for days and days. And here's the opportunity. We know pretty confidently that in a warming world, more rain will fall as heavy downpours. And one thing I also learned in covering disasters like this, as well as experiencing them, is that the standards that FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, uses for reimbursement for damage of this sort is to rebuild it to the existing standard. So tell me there isn't an opportunity to have a cogent conversation in every community that's vulnerable to climate hazards, to say, hey, are our standards, what in our standards needs to change as a result of what we can see pretty confidently is coming in a changing climate? And what should we be rebuilding this road to the same standard so it'll just get washed out again the next time? I think not. And it's a way to, then you can still have the harder discussions, the global discussions about emissions of greenhouse gases. But in the meantime, you could really engage people in these issues. And of course, energy matters. Energy matters hugely. That picture that animation in the below is a video I shot in Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant's cooling pool. And my wife and I, we live 8 miles from Indian Point, north of New York City. And I feel we should keep the plant running responsibly. She feels we should shut it down and not relicense it. And these issues are powerfully divisive, and nuclear power particularly is one of these kind of hot button issues for many communities, and finding ways forward on nuclear power, whether it's dealing with our 100 or so plants that are aging now, or how much money do we invest in new ones, new designs, safer designs, new ways of handling waste. It's important, and I think we can engage on that. And energy matters hugely in developing countries. Again, I try to remind everybody every day that while we're worrying about which kind of light bulbs to screw in, there's 2 billion people on the planet with no light bulb, and people cooking on firewood and dying prematurely again. And the other picture, which you may not see very well, is the great Indian blackout a couple months ago. 600 million people who finally got on the grid, and then the power went out. Oops. Finding ways to make systems reliable and resilient is important. So here's some sociological work that I think is a source of great optimism for me. There's a group at Yale and George Mason University. They run a study every couple of years called the 6 Americas Study. And essentially they've determined through pretty detailed surveys of people that there's kind of 6 kinds of Americans when it comes to global warming. They range from alarmed to dismissive, basically Al Gore to Jim Inhofe, and et cetera. And most of us are in that fuzzy middle. We're either disengaged, doubtful, or basically, we're low information voters. If you know that phrase from recent parodies by Bill Maher about our voting issues. So, but when you tell, a couple of years ago, when there was the run-up to the climate bill, which everyone was so focused on in the community, even the alarmed, this is basically those bubbles are those groups. So the alarmed were only at the maybe point in terms of their support for cap and trade legislation. And that said to me that whoever was thinking that bill had a chance of passing had clearly not studied this work, because when your biggest cheerleaders are like maybe on something, that says it's not really going to happen. But when you ask the same people, this is what's really cool. When you ask the same people this question, support for providing rebates for purchases of solar panels and fuel-efficient vehicles, even the dismissives are above the midline. So that's interesting. So we all kind of like energy efficiency and new energy choices. Now, are there some economists in the room? Any economists? There has to be one. None? Okay, good. So economists, what do you say when an economist sees this? An economist says, well, that's just because you're giving away money. It's all about subsidies. So that really has no meaning. But then, look at this question. Support for requiring 45 mile per gallon fuel efficiency across vehicle fleets, even at a $1,000 price premium. So you're telling people you want to mandate, requiring something. Can you imagine Paul Ryan signing on for that? Requiring. And I'm not getting into politics here. I'm just saying it's true. It's just a fact. We know he wouldn't like that. At a price premium, so it's green pork, But even then, look at the levels of support. Basically, everybody is like maybe or yes, except for the dismissives on global warming. So that says to me we've been missing an opportunity to have an engaged, productive discussion on energy innovation and energy technology, instead of having this going head-butting battle over global warming. And I think that's why, if I wrote a couple of years ago, if I had the choice between these two bumper stickers, they don't really exist. They're both very wonky, right? Fight the climate crisis and join the energy quest. I would do the join the energy quest, because I think it has more resonance for more people. And I think, especially when you consider it in the global context of all the people on Earth who don't have any sustainable energy options at all. The energy quest is from the kid studying under a streetlight at an African parking lot because that's the only place the kid can find illumination, to our issues with our carbon overabundance. So now I'm going to circle toward this communication opportunity and the noosphere. And my journey started really in, a big moment for me came in 2009 when I was writing about earthquakes. I was in Istanbul, which is a city that is extremely vulnerable to very powerful earthquakes. Through the last 1,200 years, it's been struck repeatedly and horrifically by great earthquakes. There hasn't been one. There was one in 1999 that was kind of a close call, but there's one coming that's going to really hammer it again. So the city in 1950 had 1 million people, and now it's 15 million people in Istanbul and the surrounding area. Oh, that's probably good. Hopefully that's better, yeah. Don't fall asleep now in the back. I'll try to keep it brisk. So this was a kid I met in a school that was being retrofitted. They were working on the school. This was one where they already had sort of spent millions of dollars to build the school against earthquake threat. And when you're in a place like a slum in Turkey or in a remote community in the Arctic or whatever, and you got your pad and your pencil and your camera, you're a reporter, you're like a kid magnet. So all these kids come running up to you. But here's what was interesting. Well, let's try different approaches here. Instead of, usually when kids run up to you, they're testing their English skills, saying like, American or whatever. These kids ran up to me saying, Facebook? And that really surprised me, because I'd been in some of their homes, and these are poor to working class kids. None of them own a computer or an iPod or anything. Their community center, though, had 10 computers, and these kids were all sitting there playing Farmville. And I'm sure right now they're playing Minecraft, which is my 14-year-old son's favorite game. And then I realized, wow, they're online doing massive multiplayer games, and my kid's doing the same thing. And then I said, this is interesting. So all you need is a good translation interface, and soon they'll all be playing in Turkish and English and not really knowing it, and building a global conversation about, well, it can start as Minecraft, but it can grow into other things. And I've got a piece in the works on, I would like Minecraft to add some features to that game, which is basically a building game. It's, I don't know, anyone play it? I have a little bit. Yeah, there you go. Basically it's kids running around building stuff in cool environments. And so add in an occasional earthquake. Add in a little climate change. Make them have to think about robustness as they're building their stuff in this shared gaming experience. And you could start to have some really interesting outcomes, I think. So, and there's such opportunities there. And by the way, a lot of these kids are now my Facebook friends, which is, again, illustrates to me how seamless this is becoming. But you have to go, you have to be intentional about it. You have to go out there looking for kids in Istanbul or in Sudan or wherever to try. You have to work to. If we had school programs that did, I don't know how many of you, the elders in the room like me, had a pen pal when you were a kid. When I was a kid, we had to write a little scribbly, crinkly envelope letter, send it to, in my case, to West Cameroon, to a boy named Alfred Iwani, who I still remember his name. That says that experience as a 12 or 13-year-old stuck with me all this time. And I was having a global conversation, but it was like once every 3 weeks. And now you could have a classroom in Champaign linked with a classroom, maybe they already do this, with a classroom in Istanbul or somewhere else in the world, and be co-learning together about important things. And that's the noosphere. So as I said, we don't need a new word, but it's not a new word. It comes from noosphere, which is a term that really evolved in the early sort of 1930s, 40s, in the last century. And it was a product of a French theologian, a philosopher, and a Teilhard de Chardin, and a Russian geochemist, Vladimir Vernadsky, who was the first person I know of who wrote a long time ago, early 20th century, that humans were becoming a global geophysical force. So they're interesting characters. And together they kind of circled in on this idea that we were building a planet of the mind, that they were sheathing this Earth with intelligence. And this was, remember, this is back in the era of telephones. But now, and Darwin, as I started researching this, I realized this idea went back to Darwin, who in The Descent of Man in 1871, he wrote this. As man advances in civilization and small tribes are united into larger communities, the simplest reason would tell each individual that he ought to extend his social instincts and sympathies to all the members of the same nation, and then eventually, basically globally. And he actually went on in this essay to talk about to other species, that our empathy would spread to other species. But he said only an artificial barrier prevents us from accomplishing this. And now that artificial barrier is being breached by technology, by connectedness through telecommunications and the web and all this stuff. And that's this, the new spelling is just the same word spelled differently, but it's a network of everything from schools to libraries to businesses to community centers, all trying to build out, to make sure we're maximizing the potential to share and shape ideas to smooth the human journey on a complicated, turbulent planet. And I think, again, we're just scratching at the surface of the potential of this. And I've said many times that the internet cuts in both directions. It makes us live in bubbles if we want that. It can foment terrorism, as we saw with that YouTube video. The 9/11 guys got together and learned how to fly airplanes into buildings, partially by finding their schools through the internet. So it works in both directions, but I see the upside swamping the downside. And here's this little hashtaggy thing, the pound sign. What's really interesting, I mentioned that communication technology is a sustainability technology. So is this. This is an invention. There's a guy named Richard Messina. He was a programmer for Mozilla in the early to mid 2000s, living in San Diego. And in 2007, he invented the hashtag. On Twitter, Twitter was like a new thing in 2007. And he posted this. How do you feel about using pound for groups? As in bar camp. Bar camp is like a programmer's group. And he was a programmer. So you realize when you go to Twitter and you put in a word with that little pound sign in front of it, that becomes kind of a gathering space to like in Harry Potter. What's the thing you hold on to move to a new place? And it's kind of it means that people in any part of the world who are online on Twitter at any time, by putting in a word, can have a conversation around that phrase. So, and think about this, there's one now, WJ Chat. WJ Chat, the pound sign, is a weekly conversation about web journalism, the frontiers of journalism online. Ag Chat, A-G-C-H-A-T, with a pound sign. Go to twitter.com, put that in there, and you can connect with people studying how to make agriculture better all around the world. And it's a revolutionary, simple thing. It's, you know, Facebook could do these kinds of things as well, but Facebook, as we all know, is much more about other stuff, like just, you know, my dog died, which I put on Facebook when it happened. And that's sad, and I actually blogged about it too, but that's not what, that's a whole other subject. So here's, you know, most of the stuff, and Twitter, even the name Twitter has, but it really is a powerful tool. And if you pay attention to all the noise, if you just look at it and on any particular instant, you're just seeing this flow of ridiculous stuff. It's Justin Bieber and Kardashian and Russell Crowe getting lost in his kayak off of Long Island recently, where, you know, stuff like that. But then if you use those tools, as I said, if you, all my courses at Pace University now come with a hashtag, PaceBlog, PaceENV for our environmental science communication course, PaceDoc for our documentary course. So we're sort of displaying our learning online in real time, and people can kind of come in and look at us learn, and I think that's good. NASA has figured out that in a world, the web world is full of so much garbage, so how do you kind of cut against that? NASA created a Twitter feed called Asteroid Watch. And it's now got 1 million followers. There's, you know, the world is full of amateur astronomers. I'll bet there's a few in the room. Anyone an amateur astronomer? See, well, yes, someone did, yeah. So this is all about these big bad rocks in space, one of which is going to hit the world someday and create a devastating disaster. This happened through the history of the planet. It's going to happen again. But there's always like this end of the world 2012 stuff. And so NASA said, let's cut against that and create a zone, a place to latch onto if you want to see some reality. And that's really important. But of course, as I said, you know, there's 2 billion people who don't have iPods or iPads or computers. These are the kids I mentioned who they do their homework in the capital city in Guinea by going to the airport parking lot, because that's where the streetlights are. And that's a scandal. It's addressable. There's so many opportunities for designers and business entrepreneurs to work on getting them the illumination they need and making a little money at the same time. But they're not on the web, right? So this noosphere has big gaps. But that's changing in a nanosecond. This is a wonky slide. I know you won't be able to read the numbers, but I'll tell you what it means. The International Telecommunications Union tracks things like how many people have cell phones. In 2000, there were 700 million cell phones, and 2/3 of them were in rich countries. That's the blue. Now this is in 2010, 10 years, there are 5 billion cell phones. 3/4 of them are in poor countries or less developed countries, developing countries. Of course, a big chunk of those are in China and then India, but that's still highly meaningful. It means we're all getting connected, and Twitter can happen even on a non-smartphone. But I was at a meeting last year at Pace University where they were rolling out these $8 smartphones, and you know that the pace of technological improvement means that it's just a matter of time before even the most basic phones on the planet are smart, or can give you the capacity for someone in a very poor place to be watching one of the MOOC learning experiences that universities like Illinois and Harvard and Stanford are doing online. So we have the potential to move information to where it's needed in unprecedented ways. This woman, in 2010, just to give you an illustration of how this plays out, how powerful a little bit of connectedness can be. You know, we're like bathed in connectedness. We're so spoiled with all our connectedness. But in rural Kenya, where this, if you can't see it, I'll explain the picture. There's a woman who was one of the many people in developing countries who doesn't have electricity but did have a cell phone. Cell phones have sort of leapfrogged to places that are still really off the grid in many other ways. And once a week or so, she has to go into town on the bus to charge her cell phone. Some merchant will charge her a certain amount of money. She got tired of that. It was very expensive. So she saved up enough money for like $60 to put a cheap solar panel on the roof of her mud hut. And she did that. And so her kids started doing their homework at night at home. So in a rural village in Kenya, they have her kids have access to electricity that the kids in urban Guinea don't have. And the kids' performance at school was improving. She had excess electricity. Besides charging her own cell phone, she was charging her neighbors' cell phones. So she was cutting into the business of the guy in town. And then her neighbors, here's the sort of sad, happy part. Her neighbors put her out of business because they all started buying solar panels for their roofs. And so it's like you're starting a little fire. And then with that cell phone and Khan Academy and all the potential ways to get information to zones that don't have it yet, you can see how we can fast forward some of the most struggling places on the planet to become a lot less poverty-stricken and subject to the inertia that comes with that. And the environmental costs of poverty are huge. So it's really exciting. And then things are so unexpected. Our world is, what's so great about human beings is our ability to surprise ourselves. The World Cup was coming to South Africa a couple of years ago. And some smart business people, mostly African investors, said, hey, you know, there's not going to be enough bandwidth to broadcast the World Cup to the rest of the world. So let's lay a fiber optic cable from Europe to South Africa along East Africa. So they got busy. They raised $600 million of capital. They laid this cable. And it's not that expensive. 600 million, it was all mostly African money. It wasn't like a World Bank project. And lo and behold, the World Cup came off. Everybody had their high definition soccer. And then they had all this excess bandwidth. And so now all these countries in Eastern Africa are tying in. This picture is of Tanzania, and that's the cable going from Tanzania to the fiber optic cable offshore. So the price of internet access in Africa is plunging as that plays out. And it's a profit-making venture. So I don't see, what's the downside there? Everyone is kind of working in a way that shows you that communication technology can be sustainability technology. I think it's really exciting. The noosphere can also work to link the way we learn. This is a map of a project that happened a couple of years ago called Atlantic Rising. It's atlanticrising.org, where a young team of educators from England went around the Atlantic Ocean over a period of about a year and did workshops on sea level rise in coastal communities for kids. This is the one they did in Nantucket. I just happened to be at a meeting there at the time when that was happening. And they've linked those classrooms. A lot of the kids now are linked up with kids in other countries. So Scotland is talking to Ghana about the common experience of coastal communities and facing rising seas in a warming world. And I think, again, that shows you the power of not just technology, but how we shift our learning patterns and think about new ways to learn and share, have kids have a collaborative, empathetic approach to these kinds of issues. It's just great opportunities. The noosphere can be and is becoming a global extension service. Those familiar with the history of American agriculture know that schools like U of Illinois, Cornell, you know, the extension services, the history of getting training to farmers and having ways to have innovations communicated has really been a revolutionary part of how we've progressed in agriculture in this country. And now we can do it again. Think about the farmer in Kenya with the cell phone who can now get corn price before they go to the market and know where to sell their corn, and that kind of thing is, again, improving lives at a pace that can't be replicated in other ways, I think. And what the system is kind of like is like Match.com. It really is. And I'm going to show you how it can work. It's not just for girls and boys. Scientists Without Borders is a young effort by the New York Academy of Sciences to build a portal, kind of a Match.com for problems and scientists. Village in rural Africa is trying to figure out a new water pollution treatment system. Who can help us? And for Incentive is a similar system, but it's a profit-making one. So a company needs an innovation. Who out there can help us solve this problem? So the global networked intelligence can dive in and in a heartbeat sort of get the right idea to the right problem at the right time. Philanthropy, globalgiving.org. Kickstarter, anybody supported something on Kickstarter? I have. Where you can, if you want to make a film about sanitation problems in India, you just put out a trailer, put out a little proposal online. You could say in the next 30 days, if I don't raise the money, it won't happen, but if I do, you'll be part of this project to help make a film about X, Y, or Z. It's an amazing way to match up excess capacity, meaning capital, with meaningful projects. So again, to demonstrate what I mean about the power of sharing and shaping ideas, where you're putting together skill sets that can't do something on their own, I got to go back to my earthquake reporting. I started reporting intensively on earthquakes myself, mostly after the Sichuan disaster in China about in 2008. And this is one of the schools that fell down. Completely avoidable that this school fell down. It was just really bad construction. And those are the kids who died in that school because the ties, the iron parts weren't tied together correctly. And we did a big piece in the Times about that. So I've been thinking a lot about design. You know, we're in the world's biggest, the history of the human species. We're having our greatest build out in history right now. The next couple of decades, we're building more structures by some calculations than have ever been built in history of all the structures built by people. So if you can get ahead of that, especially with schools, hospitals, things that matter, and make sure the designs are robust in earthquake zones, you're going to avoid some of the shocks that can really blunt progress in poor places. So there's a really great and innovative engineer, earthquake engineer at Purdue named Santiago Pujol. And after the disaster in Sichuan, I did a story for the science section of the paper on his novel design for building schools using the same materials that schools are being built with everywhere in the world, bricks and concrete and rebar and glass, and just reconfiguring it slightly, you get a much more robust building. Same materials, so no difference in cost, just information makes the building safer. So I went to my son, my older son, who at the time was a sophomore at Pace University. He wants to be in special effects in the movies, so he likes to use computers to make animation, you know, blow up buildings and stuff. But I said, hey Daniel, can you, here's what this thing is about. Can you make an animation to show how you can make this building safer? And so he gave it a try. And this is what it's like. So this is the problem. You get these pancaking of buildings often, where the vertical components fail like this and the floors collapse. And here the issue is when you have a half wall, those bricks butt up against the, yeah. Now, that's not perfect. He needs to do, you know, a 2.0. But watch here. So here's like, this is the better design. So let's run that experiment over again. You just do that. And now look at the shake table at Purdue. Here's a real test of that design. When the bricks fill up the space, they help support the columns instead of breaking them. And here's what that could look like as an actual building, and you know, kind of a fairly attractive classroom. So you know, I would love to get this video in front of every community in the world where they're building school buildings at a frantic pace to keep up with those billion, remember the 2 billion teenagers and younger kids? So I still have work to do. I put it on .earth. It's been seen by several thousand people. I want it to be seen by many more, but it shows you the potential to put different skill sets together and come out with a better outcome. And that also means that students can get involved in this. You know, what can you do to work with engineers on this campus to demonstrate or illustrate what they're doing in ways that can be communicated more fully to the world outside. Here's another example quickly so we don't run out of time. So on this Match.com, busy science teacher seeks. And one thing I learned at a meeting of the AAAS a couple of years ago, the American Academy for Science, Advancement of Science, is school teachers crave having little like 1-minute videos to start a discussion in a classroom about something like momentum or electricity or resistance. They don't need Frozen Planet 5-hour documentaries. They need 1-minute little explainers just to get things going. So, and I found an example on the web that was done by college students in California a couple of years ago on geoengineering.
Today on Waves of the Future, a closer look at geoengineering. What is geoengineering? Well, geoengineering is something global, intentional, and unnatural. And we've got some smart fellers figuring out new methods. Let's look at a few. Space mirrors! In this lifelike reenactment, Eric is the sun, and Patrick is the Earth. As Patrick orbits Eric, we receive some of Eric's solar radiation, making Patrick very warm. Let's see what Patrick has up his sleeve. By deploying space mirrors, Patrick deflects some of Eric's warming radiation, making himself comfortably cool.
So you get the idea. And again, now that could be worked on. There's aspects of that that are problematic. Later in the piece, they misspell the word algae, for example. So you have a setup at a school where, you know, busy science teacher seeks, student provides, climate scientists said, well, not exactly. And then you come up with a more robust iteration, and then that gets distributed to school systems in a heartbeat, just online. You know, it's a resource for those. And so I think that's another example of how this can work. And then there's the do-it-yourself aspect of all this stuff. Fracking is a big issue near where I live, in the Hudson Valley, and it has been in Pennsylvania. There was a guy in Pennsylvania a couple of years ago who, to fill the information gap, remember, in a time of shrinking budgets, it's hard for regulatory apparatuses to keep up with issues like this. So he said all the drilling data is online, the permits, the violations. So he created a website called fractrack.org for Pennsylvania drilling data. And you click on the button and you see this. You don't have to see, basically this is all the information. Was there a violation? Is this a well that's already producing? Et cetera, et cetera. What's the address? What's the GPS coordinates? And so you can get some clarity, and you can help identify bad actors, and you can help sort of build community awareness of problems in ways that, with just setting up a website. It took him 2 days to do this. I'm going to skip this slide just because I know we're running short on time. And then there's stuff that doesn't really relate to technology. I can tell you the volume of the world's atmosphere. You know, it's a certain number of cubic kilometers. Or I can show it to you, as Adam Neiman did in this illustration. That's the atmosphere. If you put all the air in the atmosphere at sea level pressure, that's the volume. It's not propaganda. It's a fact. It's a number. But it's a way of conveying the number that's different than just the traditional way. And here's all the world's liquid water, the green bubble, which looks like it's actually right over Champaign, right over Urbana. And then that's just a starting point. So that's all the world's oceans and lakes and rivers. And again, it's non-controversial. That is it. And then you say to your students, well, what's the volume of all the world's fresh water? Or what's the volume of the world's potable water? Which I believe is about 0.007% of that number. And then once they do that calculation, they realize you couldn't even show it on that map. That's a learnable moment. In other words, you're not teaching. You're fostering learning and insights by having students engage in novel ways of thinking about things. And sometimes conveying an idea more effectively is just simply a matter of choosing the right wavelength. This is, there's nothing about this picture that says there's a problem, except maybe that oil tank needs a paint job. There's a little rust stain, right? But if you look at it in infrared, this was outside of Denver a couple of years ago. The EPA commissioned someone to go around with an infrared video camera and look for methane leakage from our gas and oil facilities. And I wrote a big page one story for the Times. But I think the video I posted on the web says it much better. So here's what that same scene looks like in the infrared wavelength. Now, can you imagine if you're driving down the highway there every day, seeing that? Do you think that we would find that acceptable? Knowing that that's a potent greenhouse gas, knowing that it's a wasted resource. Remember, natural gas is a valuable fuel. I don't think so. So there, again, we have to think, what's the best tool for the job? And again, it's not always about communication technology. It's about a state of mind, a state of intentionality. And it also is about getting out of what Randy Olson, a friend of mine, calls the nerd loop. Too much climate cogitation is just cogitation. We're just talking to ourselves about how to communicate about climate instead of actually experimenting and finding new ways to talk to the public and ourselves about these issues. And these are just two experiments. Richard Alley from Penn State at the right is a very adventurous scientist who's also an adventurous and courageous, gutsy, even reckless communicator. He sings about climate change and geology, and he dances. He has this. He illustrates the Milankovitch cycle of the ice ages by doing kind of a. He says, and this is the equator, and this is the pole, and my bald spot is the North Pole. And it's great, and it's engaging, and it gets people's attention. Of course, he has tenure, so he's he can get away with all that stuff. But there are young people who are finding ways to communicate effectively. Young scientists with blogs. There's a number of them that I follow regularly who tweet and that stuff. Now, just to close here, before we move to questions, I want to acknowledge that in the end, this is not all about digital experience, that the real world matters hugely. My wife is a former science teacher. She would get her kids outside the school every spring, and they do a stream study. The kids get wet, they're turning over rocks and stuff and getting dirty, and that's a vital part of the path forward as well. And it can happen in cities as easily as in rural areas or wilderness. And so a couple of years ago, my younger son, who was 9 or 10 at the time, we went for a little row in a pretty crowded, developed part of Florida where my parents live. And we had seen some herons that were clearly nesting there, so we went back the next day with a video camera, and my son was going to make a little documentary. So this is like just a couple of seconds of that.
This is close up in the mangroves. See if we can spot any animals. Whoa, there it goes. Well, that was amazing. Looked like a statue.
First spot.
Yep.
Let's see what else is coming.
I already saw tri-colored heron babies. Let's see if we can spot them again.
Oh, here.
Those are the babies. Oh, yes, they're there, they're there.
I love that sound.
There's someone. Move over a little, I can't see it.
Get out of the way, Dad.
Yes, move in like that. Hello, little pretties. Yes, 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 come again. That's a baby tricolored heron. They are cute.
So now that is pretty cool. And you heard that sound of that yes, and that engagement, that immortal moment. But what's interesting, you know, we're all engaged and happy that he had that moment. But here he is sharing it digitally. This was actually a hybrid experience, and he put it on YouTube. We put it on my blog. Must be maybe 3 years ago. And so by sharing it now, it hasn't been like we're not talking about the Gundam dance video or whatever, which is, some of you know about that. You know, 1 billion views. But it's been out there. He's been able to kind of tell us his story, the story of his engagement with nature. So that hybrid experience is I think, illustrative of where we go forward here. And there's great power in all this. So I thank you. This is where we are, that tiny dot, and this is where I am. And I may have gone a little long, but hopefully we have time for at least a couple questions. Thank you.
Is this on? Yeah, thank you. Well, we're going to do about 10, 15 minutes of Q&A, and if you have a question for Mr. Revkin, you can line up at the microphones and we'll take turns back and forth. And in the interest of time, I just ask you to not make speeches, just ask questions, and then we'll have time for as many as possible. Okay.
What's an optimal number of people on the planet for fresh water?
The question was, what's an optimal number of people on the planet for fresh water? Well, as Joel Cohen from Rockefeller, Joel Cohen at Rockefeller University wrote the best book on population, which basically the title was, How Many People Can the Earth Support? And he didn't answer it. He said, it depends. And the answer to your question is, it depends. If we have abundant, cheap energy, we can desalinate the ocean in ways that...
It doesn't work. It's filthy.
Well, no, it doesn't.
Don't even think about desalinization.
But
it does not work.
It does. Perth, Australia is getting 20% of its fresh water from wind-powered desalination
The
plants.
rest of the place does not.
Okay, I mean, it's complicated. There are parts, like in the Hudson River, you can't do it.
I know.
Okay, next question.
So I'm very impressed with the potentiality that you show with this communication thing. But what you're not discussing, of course, is how society, world society, fits into this.
Rural?
World society,
World society,
governments,
yeah.
nations,
Yeah.
and the economic system, and how that's, I mean, it seems to me that's one of the biggest problems. That goes beyond just the potentiality of what technology, et cetera, can do. I'd like to hear your comment.
Yeah, this is an important issue, although I do think you're seeing, there are still some closed societies where communication is controlled. China is still largely controlled, although there's lots of end runs around information there too. And as the Chinese middle class grows, you're seeing much more information flowing, and you're seeing China respond to environmental problems that it had neglected through its industrial burst of the last 10 years. So I think the nationhood issue and some of those corporate questions are going to fade in the power of some of these things that I'm talking about. Now, that doesn't mean Twitter has already been appropriated by people who just want to sell more stuff. So Twitter, these tools can be used for marketing and for making us want a bigger car just as much as they can be used for the things I'm talking about as well. So I'm not saying this is going to solve the world's problems. I'm saying it's giving the best chance of softening the journey, of making sure that the speed bumps are small and not walls. That's it. Maybe here.
So you may or may not be aware that the current presumable representative of this congressional district in Illinois has been known to cite Genesis in talking about climate change. So my question is, what is known about how politicians respond to different sources of information regarding climate change? Is it similar to that information that reaches their constituents, or is it a second type of opinion source?
Well, politicians who are beholden to edge constituencies, the Tea Party being one, tend to torque their messaging and their policies toward those issues, whether it's on gun control or on emissions of greenhouse gases. I think there's not a lot of difference, or on abortion. And we're not, these issues those issues are questions that are how the Senate supermajority means you have to get 60 votes to have some reasonable prospect of legislation moving forward, is the single biggest blockade to any progress, not just on issues like this, but on almost anything you could think of. And that could swing around and flip the other way. That's why no party, either the Democrats still in the Senate don't want to get rid of the 60-vote supermajority because they know someday it'll benefit them. But at the same time, is it benefiting society? I'm not so sure. So the structural issues with our politics are beyond this. Although what I think I see, like what I said about fracking, where the public, the community can essentially assemble its own databases, can make its own case for action, can make its own reports about violations, can press politicians to act in a certain way, and companies. Transparency International is an amazing organization globally that's fostering open flows of information on problems of various kinds. And that's a one-way street, I think. It's very hard to see us tamping down that tendency toward having more transparency, and that will swamp the power of sort of conventional politics to blockade action. And then I do still point back to those slides on energy. The questions you're talking about are mostly about global warming, which has become a badge. You have your NRA, your gun rights badge, your abortion badge, your global warming badge. And it's true for liberals as well. There's an identity factor around these issues. But if you can look at the discussion around investment in energy technologies, you get a little bit more buy-in from a larger community. One last place where there's an opportunity is on subsidies. The Heritage Foundation, one of the more conservative think tanks that's out there, wants to end energy subsidies. Now they want to end all of them, meaning for renewables and as well. Have a clean slate. And a lot of people concerned about fossil fuel subsidies would like that all subsidies too. So at least there's overlap there. So I say, when you see overlap in divergent communities, that's the place to focus in on.
So I was recently at a conference where Hunter Levins talked about the virtualization of education and the growing use of MOOCs, and I forget what it stands for, but online teaching, where the questions would be crowdsourced from the tens of thousands of people that were attending, and the answers as well, potentially, and her response to my question about, well, how do we make sure that the right information gets given to the people in class? Well, by the sheer number of right answers. And I'd see a big problem with counting on sheer numbers to teach people. So the whole online education, whether it's Wikipedia or MOOCs, what's going to happen with peer review and using books that get vetted?
Well, I think what you see online is everything gets vetted in the end. And I think there is the potential to have tools online that can be as valuable for education as the conventional textbook that goes through a more formal review. Even in the science process, you know, the old traditional peer review processes, there's been lots of revelations about how problematic that fairly young enterprise, the anonymous peer review, has revealed itself as not foolproof. I can't tell you how many papers I've reported on over the years that have got into a high impact journal that turn out to be wrong, and then the rebuttal papers pile up and don't get any attention. So online, this tendency to shift to the PLOS model of journals, you know, Public Library of Science, you're going to see more of the sort of a layered peer review, where the peer review will be partially public and instantaneous, and then partially more rigorous in traditional. And I think with education, it'll be the same way. You're going to see a move toward online learning inevitably. Now, that doesn't mean that campuses will lose meaning, because there's certain things you have, collaborative work, invention, having a relationship between a university and businesses and the community around it. Like Rensselaer is a great example of a school. They have labs, invention labs, entrepreneurship labs, where they're working with the community to solve problems for businesses. That stuff is a function of a physical school in a physical place with physical relationships. So and that's why those of you in academia can feel confident there's still a role for the physical university. But it'll be more of a hub and spoke system and a hybrid form of learning where, like my son, just one last example, my son learned the After Effects software. He's taken classes at Pace and stuff like that, but he learned that by buying the software and then going on YouTube. And he's now pretty good at it. And so skill stuff like learning calculus, learning After Effects, that doesn't have to happen in a classroom. So I think, you know, it'll be a hybrid kind of outcome. I can't remember. Yeah.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about why it is that you think that traditional legal tools aren't working to help manage the population-related environmental problems. Is it that you think they're not working, or just that we ought to be supplementing with these sort of soft law tools that...
Oh, okay. Well, we have this bad habit of the climate bill. Actually, there's a paper, if you go on, the Council on Foreign Relations is a really good blogger named Michael Levy. He's energy environment. He did a piece today on a new paper that I haven't had time to read yet myself, but it says if Waxman and Markey had passed, it kind of assesses, given the trajectories we see now in energy use, largely because of natural gas and other innovations, that the way the cap and trade bill was structured, we would end up in 2020 with higher emissions than we're going to end up with now without the bill. And it's because of all those aspects of negotiating a bill that lead to a very weak instrument. The same thing was happening with the climate treaty. There's so many out clauses that it is soft law in the end anyway. And I see the climate, the treaty process still has value, getting all the world's countries together to talk, to articulate their definition of the climate problem, which is different from Ethiopia than it is for the Inuit, is immensely valuable. And it's a place to articulate what you're doing. It's a place to sort of demarcate, this is where we're going. And that alone can build us some progress. But the idea that we're going to have a firm cap on carbon at the national level or at the global level that's meaningful is, to me, I think that's ancient history. I'll give you one last example. Australia got a lot of great press for enacting a climate bill, a carbon cap. But they're also exporting millions of tons of coal to China that isn't accounted for in their domestic cap. And to me, that is complete hypocrisy. You can't, and they're saying, the response is, well, no, it's China's responsibility. You account for the emissions where the emissions are, not where the coal came from. And I think for a rich country to claim credit for having a carbon cap while it's sending its carbon to China to burn is ridiculous. So that's my thinking.
Last question.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. It was an honor to listen to you speak, and I appreciate coming here. So, one thing I noticed with your graph of the population and speed jump, if you were to put that on arbitrary scales in the past, whatever, you'd see a lot of speed jumps. You'd also see a lot of crashes, both for human population and biodiversity. And one thing I've also noticed is, like the International Panel on Climate Change, when they put out future projections, they never really consider that. If there was a population crash, there would be some uptake of carbon. I was just curious, do you know why people don't really look at that? And or do you know anybody who is considering those types of scenarios?
Yeah, there's a guy named Brian O'Neill at University of Colorado. He was at IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria. IASA does a lot of work of that sort. Much more detail on population trends and how they relate to things like carbon. So I could follow up with you later if you want. But Brian O'Neill has done some really good work on that point, exactly what you're talking about, taking more account for population change and fertility rates. And that's...
Thank you. I think through his blog, we can continue this conversation that we just begun here today. I'm going to turn it over to Bill Schultz.
Thank you very much, Andrew and Andy. I think you've given us all a lot of food for thought. We're going to have a reception out here. It's actually going on now, and perhaps we can talk to Andy briefly out there before we leave. And in appreciation of your presentation today, we have a small token of appreciation from the Prairie Research Institute.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My pleasure.